Yeah, that's nice. I think I needed a hit of water before we get into this long video. If you're interested in getting one of these mugs, like you can see here, that is available through store.hardwareunboxed.com. It's pretty nice. You can put your water in here, put your coffee in there, and yeah, I'll need a fair bit of water to get through this video so I don't hurt my voice. I've written a lot of words on this one. Anyway, welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. It is time for another optimization video, and today we're tackling, well, Tom Clancy's Ghost Recon Breakpoint, which is the latest title in the popular Ghost Recon series, and also the latest, I guess, big budget, big graphics AAA game from Ubisoft. Developed by Ubisoft Paris, Breakpoint uses the Anvil Next 2.0 engine, which is the same engine used for games like Assassin's Creed Odyssey and the previous Ghost Recon game Wildlands. For some people, this will mean a few red flags. Wildlands wasn't exactly known for the best performance out there, and neither was Assassin's Creed Odyssey. Both had pretty decent visuals depending on the area you're in, but certainly these games were big performance hogs, and in the case of Wildlands, to a pretty severe extent at launch. However, from the looks of playing this game so far, Ubisoft have stepped things up another notch in the visuals department. This game is extremely impressive visually, taking all the good stuff from previous Anvil Next titles and just cranking up the graphics basically. Playing this game at 4K, the texture quality is phenomenal, really high resolution presentation here. On top of that, the foliage system used here in this game is elite, with simulated wind, tree movement, and a really dense presentation that made both Steve and myself think of Crysis the first time we fired it up. Like with Assassin's Creed, for example, the level of visual quality does vary with the location in the game. Some of the more open plain areas don't look as good as the dense forests because the foliage system does a ton of heavy lifting here. But I'd have to say that in general, this is one of the most graphically impressive titles of 2019. Performance does suffer as a result, sometimes more than you might expect. With an RTX 2080 Ti using ultra settings at 4K, I was frequently dipping into a mid-40s frame rate, and something like an RTX 2070 Super at 1440p is barely a 60 FPS GPU. That's similar, a little worse than AC Odyssey, but much more visually impressive for what it's worth. In any case, we'll be going through every setting in the game in just a moment to see how we can get more performance at a low impact of visuals. Before that, few notes about our test setup. Our standard Core i9 9900K test rig was used here with 16GB of DDR4 memory. That's purely to keep us GPU limited, which will be the case for most people playing the game. We used a variety of GPUs from both AMD and Nvidia for these results, averaged out of course, so we can get a good general representation of how each setting affects performance across a wide variety of setups. For benchmarking, we used the in-game tool because this covers basically every graphical effect in the game. We don't use spot checks for this testing. We like to show an average or typical representation of how changing a setting will impact your frame rate. However, our image quality comparisons do focus on one area, so just be aware that the images you're seeing don't always correspond directly to where we benchmarked. It's just easy to show visual changes in static locations. We also recommend watching this in YouTube's maximum 4K quality or downloading a high bitrate version from our Patreon page. We did use the latest game-ready drivers from AMD and Nvidia for these tests. Even after installing these drivers, I did experience a bit of stuttering, but I corrected that by updating my Intel chipset driver and also setting the Windows power mode to high performance. I was messing around with the power modes a few days ago on my test system. I switched it back to balanced, but for this test did need to put it back up to high performance, which is where I usually keep it, and I guess that seemed to do the trick. Not sure if this will help anyone else experiencing stuttering, but just thought, could be worth a mention just in case. Let's talk about the presets. We have 6 of them in the game, ranging from a taxing ultimate setting through to low. These modify the individual settings in pretty predictable ways, turning down, say, ambient occlusion, shadows, geometry quality, reflections, textures, volumetric fog, the whole works. Each step down is a pretty noticeable change in visual quality, with draw distances dropping on lower settings, shadow resolution and density getting cut, and when you get to some of the lower settings, textures and terrain detail really fall away as well. The big one for me is the draw distances though, especially for the foliage. The game is denser and more alive on the higher settings. The performance you can gain from each preset is moderate, not the best scaling I've seen in a game, but better than the worst titles. In fact, it's pretty similar to Assassin's Creed Odyssey, which I guess isn't a huge surprise given they use the same engine. Moving from ultra to very high will give you about 15% more performance. High is a 33% jump over ultra, medium about 40%, and then low gives a 65% boost. If you want to use the ultimate preset instead of ultra with everything cranked to the absolute maximum, you're looking at a 15% reduction in frame rate over ultra. I don't think the presets are very good in this game, so I'll leave preset selection up to you. If you have a powerful system, I do think there's a bit to be gained from the ultimate preset. Higher end systems will be good with either ultra or very high, but given the biggest step down in visuals to high and medium, I'd say high is probably where a lot of mid-range systems will end up. Medium, given only a small improvement over high, really isn't worth using most of the time. One of the considerations you'll have to make is whether to use Ubisoft's Temporal Injection feature, which is basically a form of checkerboard rendering. With this setting enabled, each frame is rendered at a sub-native resolution, then multiple frames are combined together to form a higher resolution output. Some of Ubisoft's early implementations of this tech in PC games were pretty lackluster, but in Ghost Recon Breakpoint, it's not bad. Temporal Injection does make the image softer and reduces detail, especially for distant objects. In motion, you'll also probably spot increased shimmering. Sometimes it looks like anti-aliasing has been disabled. However, at higher resolutions, especially 4K, it can be hard to spot the difference given Temporal Injection is already using a high sample count. I found it much easier to notice at 1440p and especially 1080p. Generally speaking, I saw Temporal Injection give around a 30% performance improvement. Personally, I'd sway towards using this tech at 4K, but not using it at 1440p or 1080p. But whether you notice the temporal artifacts or less sharp presentation, I think will come down to how eagle-eyed you are for these issues, as well as the monitor size you have and so on. I'd give it a go in the game, see what you think. I think it's enabled by default, so yeah, let me know what you think in the comments. Really interested to hear whether you take the performance or visual quality option with this setting. The anti-aliasing setting in this game is really impressive in my opinion. I believe it's some form of temporal anti-aliasing, so a post-process effect, but it does a fantastic job of preserving texture detail while also smoothing out jagged edges and cutting down shimmering. This is especially crucial on all the moving foliage in the game. Turning anti-aliasing off looks pretty ugly while AA on still looks quite sharp. You can increase sharpness further by using fidelity effects sharpening. The default 80 setting is a subtle enhancement, but one I think is really worth it. Combined with a great in-game anti-aliasing and a super high texture quality, this game looks crisp on a high resolution display, especially with Temporal Injection off. As for performance hits, turning off anti-aliasing will give you about a 2% performance gain. Meanwhile, turning on fidelity effects sharpening will see you lose about 1.5% to performance on an Nvidia card and a little under 1% on AMD. These are settings I would keep enabled. Ambient Occlusion in this game is really interesting for a number of reasons. First up, there seem to be two different implementations. On the Ultimate, Ultra and Very High modes, we get very accurate ambient occlusion in differing levels of strength and density. Moving down to High and Medium seems to switch to a much lower accuracy mode, which is more just a general shadowing in the vicinity of objects. Then turning it off entirely, of course, makes the game look very flat. However, the high AO modes seem to have an issue with ghosting and fast motion. You'll see at the start of the benchmark these ugly trails on vehicles. That's actually caused by ambient occlusion. The ghosting goes away on high or medium, but with a massive reduction in overall shadowing in the world, so it is a bit of a tough choice. When looking at performance, I'd use very high here, about a 2% gain over ultra for a small visual impact. Mid-range gamers should consider the high mode given it provides a 5% improvement. I wouldn't consider using medium, and then if you are really struggling for performance, you can get an additional boost from disabling the feature. Level of detail is one of the more influential settings on game density. While this does have some impact on draw distance for static objects, the big change you'll notice is with foliage. As you step down in quality, the distance at which foliage is rendered and the distance at which foliage is animated both get reduced. And this is immediately apparent even if you step down from ultra to very high, especially in the forested areas of the game. Very high to high is an even bigger change. Then there's not much difference between high through low. Ultimate pushes out draw distances even further for a more alive feel, and if you have a top tier PC, this is one of the settings I'd turn up. For performance, I'd recommend keeping this on ultra. A 1% gain moving to very high isn't worth it, while mid to entry level gamers should consider the medium setting. Ultimate incurs a 2% performance hit. It does look better, but I still think ultra looks great, so let's bank a bit of performance here. Texture quality, I saw very little difference in performance on mid-range and high-end cards, only with entry-level systems should you turn this down, so yeah, I'd crank this all the way to ultimate. Similar situation with Anisotropic Filtering, like with texture quality, yeah, there's a reduction in visuals, especially if you get down to the 4 and 2 settings, but on mid-range systems and above, there's not much of a performance advantage until you turn it off entirely, so I'd keep this on 16. Screen space shadows provide additional shadowing density to the game world, especially from objects onto other objects, similar to contact shadows. This is a big visual upgrade in most areas of the world, and luckily it comes almost for free with a very minor hit. I'd leave this enabled pretty much across the board. Terrain quality controls the geometry level and tessellation level for elements like rocks and the ground. I found it hard to distinguish the difference between ultimate through to very high. There are subtle changes, but it's hard to spot in motion, while going down to high does start to see a drop off. From there, you'll see bigger drops on medium and especially low, which really flattens out the terrain as it seems tessellation gets disabled entirely. The best balance here is very high, where you'll get about a 2% gain over ultra. High steps things up further with a 3 to 4% gain. That's a good option for mid-range gamers, especially compared to medium. Next up is grass quality. Pretty straightforward one here. Turning this down reduces grass density and draw distance. There are some pretty dense fields of flowers and grass in this game, but honestly the difference between ultra and high is hard to spot unless you are specifically standing and looking at fields of grass. Medium and low though are quite noticeable drops in draw distance and quality, while ultimate is a noticeable step up. In terms of performance, high is a good choice here, giving 2% extra performance in general, and when you hit those big fields of flowers, as much as a 4% gain, as we can see from the 1% lows. Entry-level gamers should choose medium, where you'll see up to a 7% gain in intense grass areas. Let's blaze through screen space reflections. This only seems to affect the resolution of reflections, so the general sharpness of edges you see in water and other reflective surfaces. Very hard to spot the differences between very high and high in most circumstances, a slight drop off to medium, and then a larger drop down to low. Given moving from very high to high provides a 5% performance advantage, that seems like a safe bet for most people. If you're on a mid-range GPU though, I'd definitely consider just whacking this on low, given it doesn't remove reflections, it just reduces quality. Sun shadows is one of the biggest settings from a visual perspective. Each drop in this setting causes a noticeable reduction in shadow resolution and draw distance. Ultra to very high is a big step down in my opinion, and it just keeps dropping from there. When you get down to medium, shadows are pretty blurry and low resolution. That said, I couldn't spot a difference between ultra and ultimate. For this setting, given the big quality increase between very high and ultra, this is a setting I'd keep on ultra. Mid-range gamers should consider high. You'll gain about 5%. It looks slightly worse than very high, but a decent step above medium, which I feel is a good performance sweet spot. Let's quickly get through this next batch of settings. Motion blur is something most gamers don't like. It's a subtle enough effect in Ghost Recon, but you can gain 2 to 3% more performance from turning it off, so that's a good choice. Bloom, no performance difference here, so it just depends whether you want a bloom effect or not. I know this too can be a bit divisive among gamers. Subsurface scattering, mostly you'll see this in action in cutscenes, and it's a subtle effect, but honestly couldn't tell the difference between high and very high. You'll get a small performance gain choosing high. Long range shadows surprisingly doesn't have much of a performance or visual impact. This is another setting I'd keep on high. There is a slight fall off with low, but not a big deal. Volumetric Fog, this is the next big setting. Usually this is the danger setting in most games, with higher settings often resulting in huge performance hits for small visual changes. However, it seems Ubisoft have done some cleaning up with this option compared to their older titles, where occasionally you'd see 20% gains from this setting alone. The difference in visuals between each mode is pretty subtle. The visual indicator in the settings menu is much more pronounced than I've seen in the game so far. Ultra and Ultimate do have better detail and density, but honestly, if you're focusing on the gameplay, you probably won't notice a drop down to high. For that reason, and looking at the performance differences, I'd take that 3% extra performance from dropping down to high over ultra. Ultimate seems to be the big performance taxing mode, causing a huge 10% performance hit for a small visual upgrade. I'm pretty glad this is restricted to the highest preset here, so most gamers won't be wasting GPU cycles on running unnecessary volumetric fog if they're just, choosing ultra or the very high presets. And finally, we have fog background blur. This is a very subtle effect that applies to distant fog when you're looking across the map from up high. Quite hard to spot the difference. Given there is basically no performance impact from this setting, ends up as a personal preference thing. Alright, those are the settings in the game, some of which have moderate performance impacts, others not so much. Breakpoint doesn't really have a single hugely taxing setting, especially if you're starting off from the Ultra preset, but a combination of small tweaks here and there can result in a decent performance gain with not much impact to visuals. Here's my recommended settings for Ghost Recon Breakpoint. Starting from the Ultra preset, I drop Ambient Occlusion to very high, bump up textures to Ultimate, drop terrain quality to very high, grass quality to high, screen space reflections to high, turn motion blur off, set subsurface scattering to high, and set volumetric fog to high. Whether you want to use temporal injection or not is up to you. These settings will give you a gain either way. For mid-range gamers that want something more akin to a medium preset, I drop a few more things down to high or medium, as you can see here, but I've prioritized keeping some of the important settings up higher, like shadows and textures. Comparing our hub quality preset to ultra, it looks pretty similar overall. In this scene, the biggest change is mostly the dynamic lighting as the sun shifts around and provides updated shadows, rather than any quality downgrades. There are a few minor drops to grass density, reflections, and fog, but overall the game still looks great. Hub performance is a mixture of medium and high settings with textures left maxed out. Given high is a noticeable step down in general over the higher options, you're not going to be getting the best ultra quality visuals out of the game with this preset, but it's worth using if you're considering either high or medium for your system. In terms of performance, pretty straightforward gains here. Hub quality is providing 20% more performance than Ultra for very similar visuals. I think that's a good result and really helps push, say, 60 FPS up to 75 FPS or mid 40s to high 50s, while still giving you the stunning graphics that really help make Breakpoint the game it is. Hub performance delivers 30 to 40% more performance than Ultra, so it sits between high and medium, which is about right for the visuals. Better than medium in most areas, sometimes better than high. It's decent for mid-range gamers. So, not much else to say really on the graphics, which seem to be the highlight of the game. Just looking across a few early impressions of people actually playing it as a game, seems like there are plenty of technical issues to sort out as well as mixed opinions. I certainly did run into some technical issues myself, not quite sure how the story will play out. I haven't gotten too far into it, and really not sure whether I'll continue playing it myself. In fact, if you've been playing it, let me know in the comments below what you think and whether I should continue giving it a go. As always, we appreciate the support of our patrons who make videos like this possible. It's been a long few days to get this one up, but I wanted to tackle it before the general release, which is tomorrow. If you like what we do, give the video a thumbs up and consider grabbing some merch like this hardware unboxed coffee mug for your morning coffee. In fact, I could do with some water right now. I've been speaking for quite some time. Subscribe for more. I'll catch you in the next one.